Once an idea has taken hold of the brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate. An idea that is fully formed, fully understood, that sticks.
We're going to take a look at the rubric for this final project, but I need you to keep in mind the purpose of the rubric is to help me to grade, not to be a guide for you, which is important because that means things aren't necessarily in order and some of these overlap with each other, and that helps me to be able to grade precisely what was needing to be fixed or what was wrong so that you know exactly where you lost points. It starts off like the other rubrics where you have 100 points and then things that are wrong are minus points. You might notice these tend to be smaller values than in the homework. That's on purpose, okay? On the final project, if you mess this up, it doesn't mean that your final project goes from 100% down to 90%, but these are how many points you might lose based off these categories. So as I'm grading, what I'll do is I'll pull up this rubric and I'll also pull up your assignment, and then on another tab, I'll pull up your assignment and go down to the appendix so that I can see the computer output while it's grading. Sometimes I'll put comments in the rubric, sometimes I'm typing it into the report itself, so you'll want to look in both places to get all the feedback. All right, let's go through these one by one. We have formatting, a title. The title, of course, shouldn't be final project or enemy data, something that describes what you're doing in one sentence. We do not have rules about does it need to be double spaced and what about margins and what about font, just as long as it looks like an actual report that you would give to a client. Readability, English grammar. Usually this one would have been fixed if people had just read their own report. So when you're done, go back through and read it and you'll find that half sentence you forgot to finish or whatever else. Intro, what the client wants, what's the value of the project. This is more than just trying to predict a variable or trying to predict enemy deaths. This is about the safety of the free world as we go to war with a country that wants to enslave and pretty much destroy everything. And this is a pretty common one for people to lose points on. Make it sound like your project or report is going to have benefit and going to be important and it's going to change the future. What programs used, of course, is pretty easy. It's probably, I assume, R for most of you. Find the errors and justify the resolution. Did you change the data set? Did you delete some data points? Did you multiply them by some value to turn them positive? Whatever things you did to change the data set, put that in there. What alpha was used, probably 0.05, or you could say 95% confidence, either way. When we're talking about the enemy deaths, describe the distribution. Some students like to have a histogram, some students like to describe the mean and the standard deviation. Something to give us an idea. Are we talking about dozens of enemies killed? Hundreds? Thousands? How many enemies are we talking about? Did you put in polynomials? Do you have interactions? Now, if you did have a polynomial, explain why you put that in. Probably because you looked at the residual plots and it indicated curvature in the data and you decided to do a polynomial. If you didn't have a polynomial, that's okay. That might be the way that your project is. Just explain that you looked for polynomials and the residuals did not show a pattern that needed that. Same for interactions. Now, when we talk about the variables that are in your model, this is at the core of what those generals wanted to know. As we change the amount of firepower, what happens to enemy deaths? As we change the amount of bombs, what happens to enemy deaths? Yes, there's a lot of these, and you'll notice they're all worth 2 points, which adds up. But go through and explain each of the variables, and later in the rubric, it'll actually talk about different types of explanations, so we'll get there. Some of these variables might not be in your model. That's fine. Somewhere you should mention these variables were taken out. Why? Because they weren't significant. They didn't help us predict enemy deaths, so we took them out. It can't be that you just ignore them and forget to talk about them. The client deserves to know that you took that out of the model and why. That way they don't worry that you just forgot. So all the way down here, justified with residuals. We've hammered that on a lot of reports by now. You should be able to tell the client, I have a way to check that I have the right model, and I did check and I have a good model. S, that's the standard deviation, explained in context. That's how far off predictions are expected to be. Are you supposed to be getting how many enemy deaths down to the nearest 2 deaths? That's really good. The nearest 20 deaths, the nearest 2,000 deaths, it matters. How well can your predictions predict? R squared as a percentage. Now, sometimes you can say R squared is 30%, which means our predictions aren't that great. You should be getting something lots higher than 30%. Think, 99%. Or you can say R squared is the percent of variability in enemy deaths explained by my model. The confidence interval for the small beta, if you recall, one of the generals specifically requested that. I don't necessarily care if it's the smallest beta or even a small beta. Just pick a beta. If you need help picking a beta, then pick a small number beta and do a confidence interval for it. The actual prediction equation. The client should be able to read your report and do predictions because your prediction equation shows up in the report. You were asked to do a prediction for the first row, so that should definitely be in the rubric. How do you maximize enemy deaths? Now, up here, you might talk about that. It makes sense somewhere to have part of your report where it says, overall, do these things to maximize enemy deaths. Have lots of, I don't know, bombs, but not much media suppression. I don't know, whatever your report says. Some little piece where the client can say, aha, this is what we need to do to win the war. As you're explaining those effects, are you able to explain linear effects? Those should be done with a sentence that uses the number. Polynomial effects, the number is not really going to help much. Most people don't understand quadratic equations by looking at the numbers. But a graph makes it really easy to explain what's going on. It should have a graph and an explanation with it. Categorical effects, again, we can use a sentence with the number. Categorical interactions, there is a way to do it with the number. I've seen some students try. Some have actually done pretty well. Most people prefer to just have a graph and then explain what's going on in the graph. Numerical interactions, there's definitely got to be a graph. And it says descriptively with it because a graph alone isn't enough. You need to have something telling the client what they should be seeing in that graph. Interpreted the confidence interval, not just having a value, but saying we are 95% confident that the slope is between these two bounds. Discuss the accuracy of the prediction. I added this to the rubric because a lot of people were like, here's my prediction, 5,000. It's like, okay. The actual value is supposed to be 5,002. Come on, talk about that. You should be proud of how good your prediction was compared to the actual value. If you're missing that, you're missing a real punchline that was really cool. The value of the report as part of the conclusion. Okay, this isn't we concluded that we have a good model or we've concluded that we can really predict enemy deaths well. This is about a war. This is about freeing the world from the oppression of Latveria. So talk about the value of what's in that report. Output explained in the paper. This is where we can take off points if you had, for example, our output that you just dumped in there without explaining what was in that. And the appendix shows the summary fit and the residual plots. That was specifically requested, and it's requested by me so that I can grade your paper. So there you have it. That's what's in the rubric. The next couple of videos, I'm actually going to do a final project, one that I made up without seeing before so that you can get a feel for what it's like to go through these things.